All right. Well, my phone is telling me that it is 6:30 p.m. And if my phone says it, it must be true. So we are going to get started. I just want to make a few statements before I pass it over to Mesrab. I want to start by thanking everybody for coming to tonight's lecture on the United States and Southeast Asian militaries during the Cold War. The audience, I'm asking you guys to remain muted during the presentation, but you'll be able to unmute yourself afterwards during the question and answer portion, so you can ask Mesrab any questions that you have. After the question and answer portion is over, I'm going to put a link to a survey about tonight's program in the chat function. I've actually already put the link in there, but I'll put it in there again. And if you wouldn't mind taking a minute to complete this survey, it's only about 4 or 5 questions, and we really appreciate any feedback that you can give us. Once the lecture begins, I'm going to turn off my audio and video, but I'll still be here to assist with any technical difficulties. If during the event you have any questions relating to technology, please message me privately, or if you can't figure out how to do that, you can just message the group using the chat function, and I'll do my best to assist you with any tech problems. And please hold your questions, like I said, for Mesrab until the end. I'd like to thank the NAU Center for Southeast Asian Studies and Rachel Skog in particular for partnering with us to make tonight's presentation possible. Our speaker is Mesrab Vardavarian. Mesrab has a PhD in history from the University of Cambridge. And with that brief introduction, I'm going to pass this program over to our expert here, and I hope you all enjoy the lecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Samantha, and thank you all for coming tonight. I do wish I could be there in person, but as we all know, circumstances dictate otherwise nowadays. So, but it's great to have this chance to present to you remotely. So, I'm going to be discussing the interactions of the United States diplomatic and defense establishments, and indeed the presidential administrations, with Southeast Asian militaries during the Cold War, using 3 case studies, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines specifically. These are the 3 countries with which the United States had the deepest and I think most enduring interactions during the Cold War decades. So roughly the late 1940s to the late 1980s, depending upon how you want to how you want to frame the chronology. But certainly by about 1948, 49, that is very much the centerpiece of American foreign and defense and strategic and security policy. Now, I do emphasize these 3 countries rather than the most obvious case study, that is the Vietnam War or the larger Indochina conflict, because I do think that that is a fairly well understood event in American history. It's become a part of public knowledge or common knowledge. Most people are very aware of the misadventure or misapplication or malapplication of American power to South Vietnam and Indochina more generally, and what that resulted in. Hence, I want to shift the focus to a set of countries which are not as well considered and not as well known in the public domain. There is a lot of academic work on these countries, but they tend not to be put in a comparative frame of mind. There's very individualist, country specialist focus on the Cold War in each particular country, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. But to see them over a broad canvas in a comparative frame is less typical, less usual. All right. Now, what was the Cold War in Southeast Asia outside this very obvious Vietnam or Indo-Chinese conflict that engaged the United States massively for almost a period of 20 years? It was very simply the containment of communism and indeed leftist currents within these countries that tried to pull the pull their respective countries away from the United States and either toward the communist bloc or toward a more neutral geopolitical and economic position. The United States used its stupendous power, its stupendous wealth, and its stupendous influence to resist any such tendency to pull away from the American orbit during these decades. Again, we focus, I think, a little too much on Vietnam at times. However massive and violent and cataclysmic that conflict was, there were other things going on in the region. And I would venture to say that the United States outside of Indochina was actually fairly successful at maintaining these three countries, assuring that these three countries didn't stray into the communist bloc or into the neutralist camp or into the anti-Western camp, right? Not for pretty reasons. It's a very grim, violent, and bloody story in all three countries. And I'm well aware of the moral implications of making a statement like this. But as far as Cold War objectives go, in a cold calculation, in Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, the United States won the Cold War in these countries, not in Indochina, but in these three countries. I would venture to say that it did. How did it assure, or how did it eventually achieve victory in these places? Generally, it did so by allying, arming, training, and financially supporting extremely repressive and violent military institutions. In some places, the violence was worse than others, but there was no shortage in any of these three cases. That's to be sure. And it also empowered and politicized the militaries of these three countries, or indeed manipulated the politicization that was already occurring in these militaries in a certain way that benefited the United States. I'll start with Thailand. So in Thailand, you had a country that already had a political military. Indeed, the military had overthrown the Thai monarchy in 1932. In 1933, it defeated attempts at restoring absolutist rule in what was then called Siam, what becomes Thailand in 1939. And the military itself becomes a very detached institution in certain respects. Now, what do I mean by that? It becomes very capital-centric, capital meaning Bangkok, capital of Thailand. It bases its politics, its activities in the capital of Thailand. There are various factional struggles, various coups, counter-coups, plots, purges, show trials, this, that, and the other thing. It's a very convoluted period in Thai history from 1932 to about 1952, even into 1957, I would say, in some respects. Politically, things are very, very unstable. What the United States does in 1950 is it makes Thailand the unsinkable aircraft carrier, the stationary aircraft carrier, if you like, of its operations in Indochina. Now, of course, as I'm sure most of you are well aware, the United States, by 1949, with the collapse of China to the communist regime, and certainly in 1950, with North Korea's invasion of South Korea, saw East Asia and Southeast Asia as main fronts in the Cold War. If the United States didn't intervene to contain the spread of communism, it would course all through Southeast Asia, into Australasia, and indeed into South Asia and beyond. That was this typical kind of domino theory, this Eisenhower virulently right-wing interpretation of the Cold War, the domino theory, which the left wing accepted as well. Democrats and Republicans, very broad-based bipartisan consensus in this respect. We have to help the French in Indochina. How do we do it? Well, we do it through Thailand, right next door, a relatively stable country, comparatively speaking, of course, in the sense that most of its politics, most of its disorder is based in Bangkok. the countryside does have seething resentments and rivalries and tensions, but they never reach the level, right through this period that I'm discussing with you here, they never reach the level that you see in Vietnam. They don't even reach the level that they do in Laos, right? So there's resentment, but it's manageable. And there is a military that by and large is extremely conservative, very right-wing, and it's already politicized. So we can do business with that military by arming it and training it. Initially, the United States sees Thailand, as I said, a bastion, this is the rhetoric of the time, a bastion of the free world, a kind of bulwark against the spread of communism. But as the years progress, okay, by certainly the late 1950s, Thailand becomes less and less of a stationary bulwark against the spread of communism and more an active belligerent in the Second Indochina War. I stress Indochina because Thailand is involved, heavily involved in Laos. And there are also certain activities it engages in Cambodia. And it indeed sends troops into South Vietnam in the late 1960s. So there is this shift from stationary bulwark against the spread of communism to active China. As a result of launch an air war in North Vietnam in the 1960s, mid 1960s, late 1960s, and into the 1970s, it constructs a series of military bases, unlike the Philippines, interestingly. These are not, they never were considered American bases. There were always Thai bases with a Thai flag, a Thai commander, but they were built, maintained, expanded, and operated overwhelmingly by the United States Air Force. Okay? This results in a military that is less focused in the capital and that percolates outward into the provinces of Thailand. It becomes a more nationalized, militarized military. In other words, militarism and the military itself spreads into the Thai periphery, pushed in almost by the United States through massive economic and material assistance. And of course, weapons, military tactics. The Thai military was already Americanized, I would say, during the Korean War, in which the Thai military participates on the US's side. But in the 1960s, it becomes massively so. In addition, under the military regime of Sarit Tanarat from 1957 to 1963, the United States empowers, or indeed, I would say more accurately, encourages the repoliticization of the Thai monarchy. Okay, so there are two streams to this. There's the monarchy and there's the military. And indeed, the United States is very happy to encourage the Thai military to re-engage or repoliticize the monarchy because, you know, monarchies, Buddhist monks are not communist. Indeed, they are virulently anti-communist, right? Now, this eventually results in a situation where the United States basically occupies Thailand for a period of about 10 years from the early 1960s to about 1973. And the basis, or the US doesn't leave Thailand officially until 1976. But this is the peak of American involvement, 1963 to about 1973. And indeed, most of the air war against North Vietnam is waged through Thai air bases, to the extent that they're actually launching B-52 strikes from Thai air bases by 1967. So it's a huge, huge, massive presence. After this, the US packs up and leaves, but the power, the weaponry, the ideology, the mentality of the Thai military remains. And it remains with us, really, I would say, until the present day. Even though American influence in Thailand has declined, and the United States is not so overly concerned with Thailand, or certainly not as much as it was 50 years ago, the behaviors, the actions, this kind of almost deep, near obsession, I would say, with counterinsurgency, psychological warfare, certain propagandistic activities, all of that comes, not all of it, but the vast majority of it comes from this, what is called in Thai studies, the American era, which is roughly from about 1950 to about 1975, 1976. So we see a process, indeed, I think a very successful process of what's called in Southeast Asian studies more generally, localization. Localization, meaning initiatives that are external in origin to the region. And there's a deep history of this in Southeast Asia. Buddhism, the incorporation of Buddhism, the incorporation of Islam, the incorporation of Christianity in the Philippines, all of these were processes of localization. External forces, external ideologies, external ways of statecraft and doing things are localized by indigenous elites. And I stress, of course, elites. These are the people making the decisions, after all, in any country, here or anywhere else. Local elites incorporate these ideas because it benefits them. Their benefit comes from these ideas. Their power increases due to these ideas, right? And that's basically the arc of the narrative of American involvement in Southeast Asia. You have a period of about 25 years, 1950 to 1975, where the US is profoundly, directly involved in Thai security and diplomatic and foreign policy. It kind of packs its bags and leaves in 1975, 76. But by that point, all of these tendencies of a heavily armed military, deeply engaged in provincial life and politics, profoundly embedded in local communities through roads, infrastructure, bases, and I think most importantly, a politicized monarchy. All of that continues well after the Americans leave. And we are seeing the legacies of that today, right? The idea that Thai society has moved on, yet it is faced with a bureaucratic elite that is deeply, deeply embedded in a Cold War culture, mentality, and Cold War operating procedures. Okay, so to jump over to Indonesia, you also find a deeply politicized, anti-colonial, in this case, regime in charge, or an anti-colonial movement that pursues independence in Indonesia through force of arms. Okay. Initially, the United States had not been very keen on supporting the Indonesian anti-colonial movement. They felt, accurately, I think, that Holland, which is an important ally in Western Europe, needed to return to its colonies because it needed the resources and wealth of the Indonesian archipelago to rebuild a country that had been certainly very badly damaged by the Second World War. Holland was in a state of semi-devastation. However, they very soon realize that the Indonesian anti-colonial army, which was founded and organized by the Japanese, hardly a very liberal group of people under Japanese occupation, was their best bet at defeating communism. The enemy is communism by 1948-49. Who can assure us best? Who can give us the most assurance that communism will not spread to Indonesia, which is a very rich country. It has oil, it has rubber, it has rice, it has sugar. We can't allow the communists to take these resources and deny them to our allies in Europe. In pursuance of that, we don't need the Dutch to come back anymore. The Dutch were too unpopular. Instead, what we have is an anti-communist nationalism in Indonesia, an anti-communist military, a burgeoning anti-communist military that is in a state of still forming at this time, but it is consolidating itself. Why don't we support the anti-communist nationalists? And indeed, when the Dutch start to attack or re-engage the war in 1948 with the second police action, the United States says, well, if we allow the Dutch to wipe out the anti-colonial movement, then we're wiping out our best chance of containing communism. So the US, in no uncertain terms, tells the Dutch, either you stop attacking the anti-colonial forces, or we cut off all martial aid to the Netherlands. The Dutch cannot contest this ultimatum, and they fold, and Indonesia becomes independent at the end of 1949. However, the politics in that country were, to say the least, quite tumultuous. You see the formation, you already had the formation of various Islamist, communist, Catholic, secular nationalist religious groupings that had their own youth wings, their own semi-militias, and you have a deeply fragmented Indonesian military. The Indonesian Navy and the Indonesian Air Force sides with the communist bloc. The Indonesian Army sides with the United States because that army has a deep, profound, right-wing, almost I would say, ideological commitment to combating leftism and communism. In some senses, it's motivated by an Islamic background, but not exclusively. I think this is more a kind of political anti-communism. Again, as in the United States at this time, some of it is driven forward by religion, but in the main, I would say no. The main anti-communist generals in the Indonesian army are not Islamist in inclination. If anything, they are the inheritors of the Japanese tradition of militarism. A tradition of militarism which believes that you can have a right-wing guerrilla army, a right-wing army that engages in unconventional operations in order to contain the left in Indonesia, right? And indeed, I don't want to get too much into the details here. I could get into more of this into the discussion, but just to briefly point out, even the Indonesian army isn't fully unified. There are certain units, particularly in Java, you have certain army divisions that are pro-Sukarno. There are others that are anti-Sukarno. Some are actually quite sympathetic to the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI. Some are virulently anti-communist. What the US does is it allies, encourages, trains, forms deep and profound linkages with the most anti-communist elements in the Indonesian army. Okay? Come 1965, in a very convoluted series of events I don't want to get into here, the Indonesian army, or the most anti-communist elements of the Indonesian army, seize power and launch a vicious political pogrom, which results in 1965, early 1966, a period of about 6 months, results in at least 500,000 people on the left and the moderate side of Indonesian politics and the left being killed. At least 500,000, possibly more like 1 million. Again, we don't have the numbers because the people who committed these massacres remain in power after they're over, and they don't tend to advertise exactly what it was that they did. So even now, we don't know what the numbers are. Most experts, most Indonesianists that I know, say it's between at least 500,000 to 1 million, probably more like 1 million, right? How is this possible? Does the army do this all by itself? Absolutely not. It couldn't have killed that many people in so short a space of time, had it done everything by itself. What it does is it co-opts militias, Islamist militias and secular nationalist militias, also some Catholic militias, into its killing machine, all right? And it encourages, enables, and allows mass murder to occur with the understanding that these things can occur with impunity. There will be no one held to account. Indeed, it is your patriotic duty to kill communists, right? And it has a very, as gruesome as this is, it's important to realize there is a kind of cascading effect to this as well, in the sense that in certain parts of Indonesia, like Bali, like Central Java, you do have very militant anti-communist special forces units that come in, that kill communists themselves and say, this is what we expect all of you patriotic Indonesians to do in turn. Now, some of them do it quite willingly. Some of them do it under coercion. But I think most of the militias participate as a result of a kind of momentum that builds up and really just can't be stopped after a certain point. Once you have state actors, state soldiers committing massacres and saying, this is what we expect of you, it isn't too hard to understand why so many people eventually took part in the massacres themselves. Interestingly enough, the United States encourages both streams of mass killing. It encourages the Indonesian Army, in a more conventional sense, by providing it with rice, by providing it with transistor radios. They might have indeed even provided weapons, although this is in dispute. A lot of the archival record is still classified. And they encourage the militias. Islam is an ideal enemy for communism, just as Thai monarchy is an ideal enemy for Thai communism. Islam is an ideal enemy for Indonesian communism. Hence, we support it. Now, after these massacres, what occurs is that the country is basically opened up to Western multinationals. Huge US corporations flood in, make the typical profits off of cheap labor. It's a very familiar story. I don't think it, and it's very typical. You can see instances of this in Latin America and so on and so forth, the Middle East. But I think the brutality and the bloodshed in Indonesia was really on a staggering and quite unique scale. The only thing that approaches it is probably some of these military regimes that the US supports in Central America. And even there, it never quite reaches this level, simply because I think the army and wide swathes of Indonesian society merged to conduct the pogrom. After the pogroms are over, as some people have explained it, seen it as a kind of genocide. I don't fully agree with that. That's something I can again return to in the discussion if you like. After the pogroms are over, the Indonesian army reverts to a kind of brutal police force that protects corporate investors and makes sure leftism or any kind of radical populist-based politics does not emerge in Indonesia to threaten corporate power and wealth. So this is indeed a staggering success. And indeed, there is an interesting connection here, which I'd like to allude to quite briefly. If you look at chronology, in 1965, the US National Security Council, State Department officials, military officials all say, if we escalate the war in South Vietnam, then the Indonesian army will be encouraged to escalate its war on communism in Indonesia. And they were right. They were right. The Indonesian army saw what the US was doing next door in South Vietnam, bombing the north and flooding South Vietnam with American ground forces. And they said, well, if we have our showdown with the communists, if we declare total war on the communists, we're going to have the US backing us. Look at what they're doing right next door. We can do something similar here. not in the same kind of technologically sophisticated way, but certainly engaging in violent actions that are just as destructive as anything you see in South Vietnam. Indeed, probably even more destructive in some respects, at least over that brief period of time when the massacres take place. So again, it's astoundingly successful. The US, I think, and I'm not the only one to say this by any stretch of the imagination, by defeating communism in Indonesia, the United States basically wins the Cold War in Southeast Asia, basically. In many respects, after a certain point, after Indonesia was freed from the communist danger, the United States didn't need to continue escalating the war in South Vietnam. But by that point, I think it had reached such a momentum that, again, it was very difficult to stop. So the Philippines is a very interesting case, and it's in many ways, I think, the most complicated because you have the deepest history here. There is a profoundly deep history of American colonial involvement with the Philippines. And indeed, the Philippine military of today is an American institution. It was founded by the United States in, well, however you want to date this, by 1901, okay? They basically found two institutions, formalized the existence of two institutions, the Philippine Scouts and the Philippine Constabulary. The Constabulary is a kind of insular national police force engaged in domestic repression, and the Scouts are soldiers in the United States Army, okay? They are American soldiers who happen to be Filipinos. They're not used as a foreign legion in the manner of, say, Anglo-Indian soldiers are, but they are personnel under the administration, paid for, kept up by the American Army. And throughout the US-Philippine relationship, throughout the 20th century and well beyond indeed, the United States repeatedly intervenes in the Philippines to refurbish, reinforce, and repurpose this military. Okay, just to give you two very well-known examples. After independence was granted to the Philippines in 1946, the Philippines faces an agrarian insurgency, the Hukbalahap insurgency, that attempts to redirect and enact wide-ranging structural socioeconomic reforms, basically a kind of downward distribution of wealth, to put it in one sentence. That's all well and good. However, by this point, the United States is the hegemon of the Asia-Pacific, no question of that. In many respects, it still is the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific even today. And it requires, in order to maintain that hegemony, that dominance, certainly, it needs military bases to do so. Not like in Thailand, where you have basically American bases that are called Thai bases and run by Thai personnel, but American bases with American flags, American commanders, an open, bold, naked declaration of a US presence in these places. Why is this so? Well, to put it very simply, the United States was the power that won the Pacific War, not Russia, not Britain, not Australia. All of these countries contributed to the US victory, but there's no question that the US was the one to defeat the Japanese in the Pacific War. It suffered the most casualties in the fight against the Japanese in the Pacific, according to its calculus. I mean, there are all kinds of other fatalities that result indirectly, but I want to leave that aside for the time being. We conquered the Pacific. We fought on the beaches. We conquered the atolls. What we say in the Pacific goes. Okay? So there is a kind of, in the minds of US commanders, we are morally justified in doing what we like in these places because we are the ones who liberated these places or conquered these places from the Japanese. No third party has any right to tell us what to do in our backyard. Okay. In order to sustain these bases, they have to maintain in power very right-wing, anti-reformist political elites. In order to assure the continued dominance of those elites, they have to repurpose the Philippine military. So as I said, the scouts were a kind of external defense force. The constabulary was an internal police force. In 1950, what the US Military Advisory Group in the Philippines does is it merges the two organizations, the constabulary and the scouts, into the armed forces of the Philippines. The constabulary is still a kind of wing, just as the Philippine Army is a wing of the armed forces, but they're all under one single umbrella organization. And that organization is committed to internal repression, counterinsurgency. And in 1951, just to make no bones about it, the United States, with its mutual defense treaty, the US-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951, which is still in force, okay, assumes the external defense burden of the Philippines. You guys concentrate on your own problems internally, we'll take care of everything externally, all right? And this results in the defeat of the insurgency in the Philippines, the Hukbalahap insurgency in the Philippines. A similar dynamic is occurring in the 1980s, just to fast forward 4 decades or 3 decades into the future. In the 1980s, you also have a more Marxist, indeed a openly Maoist counterinsurgency. The Huks were not, in my view, the Huks weren't really communists. They were kind of agrarian reformers, people fighting for agrarian reform. And they had some communists in them and among them, but they were not ideologically committed to a communist vision. In the 1980s, you do have the Communist Party of the Philippines and its military wing, the New People's Army, waging a Maoist agrarian struggle to topple the neo-colonial, what they called at that time, neo-colonial Philippine regime, led by Ferdinand Marcos. The United States sees, I think a bit too late, but it sees that the Marcos regime cannot defeat the communist insurgency. They have to bring in people who are more popular with wider sectors of the population. And they have to reform the armed forces. By the 1980s, the Philippine military had become an institution committed by and large to regime defense, not state defense, not internal repression, but defending the Marcos regime. That's not the same thing as fighting communism, all right? We have to pull the military away from regime defense and get it back into the fight against the NPA, the New People's Army. And we do that through encouraging the victory of Corazon Aquino, yes, but I think, and again, this is the victory of Corazon Aquino, if you're of a certain age, I myself don't remember these events very well, but if you are of a certain age, you do remember them very well. And if you've looked at Southeast Asian studies in any detail, they're very well known and I think thoroughly documented and very discussed in great detail. We know the story of the emergence of Corazon Aquino and her overthrow of Ferdinand Marcos. But we know less, or we are less aware, I think, than we should be perhaps, of the role of a faction of the Philippine military. So again, just as the United States uses a faction of the Indonesian Army to get its way in Indonesia, it also sides with a faction of the armed forces of the Philippines to get its way in the Philippine archipelago. And it makes sure that faction is empowered, pushed forward, and allowed to consolidate. That faction was led by Fidel Ramos, who was the head of the Philippine Constabulary, but also has deep connections with the Philippine Army in his background. West Point educated, right? Okay, so he's very integrated into the US defense network and establishment. We make sure that his faction becomes the dominant faction in the armed forces of the Philippines in order to make sure that the war against communism will continue, in order to make sure that access to Clark and Subic, the military bases we have at Clark Airfield and Subic Bay, are sustained for the duration of the Cold War. Of course, these bases closed in 1992 because most Filipinos were so disgusted with American support of this very sleazy regime of Ferdinand Marcos that they wanted the US presence to end, right? So the bases are closed. But that faction that the US empowered in the 1980s, the Ramos Faction is what I would call them, continues to be the dominant faction in the Philippine military. And it still is the dominant faction. Fidel Ramos himself is still alive. He's very elderly. He's in his early 90s, but his successors, his younger cohorts, who are now also getting up there in terms of age, but nevertheless, are still running the show in the Philippine military. They're not hegemonic, but they are the dominant group. And basically, they want two things that are of profound importance. They want to see the US alliance continue, and they want counterinsurgency campaigns against the communists to continue and against radical Islamic terrorism. Now, is the Philippine military that committed to wiping out radical Islamic terrorism? No. But if they pursue combat operations against radical Islamic terrorism, all kinds of goodies will come from Washington. Weapons transfers, training programs, joint exercises, interoperability with the United States, indeed, with the closure of Clark and Subic in 1992, and with the declaration of the War on Terror in 2001, there's a fundamental shift in the mode of engagement by the US with the Philippines. It's no longer about military bases. And I think, you know, the Bush administration was not, in my mind, very successful in terms of its foreign and defense policies. But with the Philippines, it actually did get some things right. They understood. Rumsfeld, Powell, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff understood in 2001, 2002, 3, 4, that we're not going to use this new war on terror to reestablish bases in the Philippines. That's probably more of a headache than it's worth. It raises all kinds of questions of sovereignty, and we have all kinds of mean and ugly incidents of, you know, fence line shootings or GIs or Marines committing sexual assaults and things like this. We'd rather not have that be a daily issue with us. What we will do instead is ramp up joint exercises. Indeed, the US still conducts joint exercises in Thailand, the Cobra Gold exercises. In the Philippines, they're called balikatan, the arm-in-arm exercises, which encourages interoperability, integrating the Philippine armed forces into the US defense structure. Is this to combat Islam? Yes, but more importantly, it's to make sure that we have the military on side against a rising China. No matter who gets elected president in the Philippines, as long as we have the military on Washington's side, we can pretty much get what we need out of that area. With some problems in recent years due to the election of Rodrigo Duterte, an avowedly anti-American, self-declared communist, in some very bizarre sense, president. But it almost really doesn't matter. We don't have to overthrow Duterte. And of course, under the outgoing administration, we didn't want to overthrow Duterte because Trump and Duterte had quite a bromance, I think. But that's almost an irrelevance. Beneath this political brouhaha, at the policy level, there are interactions and linkages that have continued very, very obviously. I think if you had followed these events at all, and I think I gave them a bit of my attention over the years, if you looked at the interactions between James Mathis, Secretary of Defense from 2017 to 2019, and Delfin Lorenzana, the Secretary of National Defense, basically Mathis's counterpart in the Philippines, they sustained the relationship. The presidency has changed in the Philippines and the US, but the militaries remain the same. They remain the same. and they continue, right? So once we step back, once we look away from the Vietnam experience and we trace out developments in the neighborhood, we can see all kinds of very interesting and I think surprising developments that we tend not to think about when we focus just on the ephemeral Vietnam experience. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to entertain any questions you may have.
All right. Thank you so much, Masrab. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So everybody's able to unmute themselves. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask Masrab yourself. Or if you'd like, you can put it in the chat function and I'll read it to Masrab. Anybody at all?
Left you speechless?
Yeah, apparently you answered everybody's question. So very, very thorough job.
Okay.
Well, if there are no questions, I have just posted the, whoops, let me get that. I've just posted the link to our survey again in the chat function. So again, if you could just take a minute or two to fill that out, we do really appreciate any feedback that people can give. And this program has been recorded, so we will put it up on our website. It'll be up on the library's YouTube channel within a couple days. Carolyn says excellent program, excellent presentation, Masrab. So I just wanted to pass that along to you.
Well, thank you.
And it'll be posted on our website. So if you want to go back and review it, or if you want to recommend it to somebody who couldn't be here tonight, that would be wonderful. All right. It doesn't sound like we have any questions, or if there are any questions for me. That's okay. Apparently you did a very wonderful job letting people know about the subject. So thank you again, Masrab, for doing this. We're very excited to always, provide these programs. It's always, we always want to do things in person, but right now I'm just happy that people are still agreeing to do virtual stuff for us.
Sure.
As well.
Happy to do it. Thank you, Samantha.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yes, you'll send me the link when you post it, yes?
Yes, I will send you the link. I can just send you the link to the YouTube video once it's posted.
Okay, yeah, that's totally fine. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a wonderful rest of your night.
Take care.
Bye.